Hey, welcome everyone. This is Gregory Muna, aka Master Moo, for this week's update of Art is the Church of God the Creator. Our joking, not joking subtitle for these ongoing discussions of aesthetics, the intersection of aesthetics, theology, philosophy, science, trying to bring together classical perspectives from both the East and the West with modern day science and our own lived experience. Last week, we looked at the Mandala Principle teachings. We dipped into the Mandala Principle teachings of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and looked how that intersected with the idea of the Christian theology of the cross as is outlined by Carl Jung in Mandala Principle, and how that intersected with the Pythagorean idea of the pentad and how that connects to my artistic practice of five limit tuning of traditional diatonic melody and harmony in my musical compositions, of which you're hearing one in the background right now. And so just trying to connect those things together. Today, I'd like to give another update to Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, a short update, and that's in, if you're using this edition, it's from chapter 9, pages 97 and 98. And the last time we checked in was up through the first part of August of 2025. So it was her family. We read the entries for August 3rd through 19th. We read the entries for August 2nd and Sunday, August 3rd, and then for Sunday, August 17th, Monday, August 18th, and Tuesday, August 19th, and that's where we left off at the top of page 97. And now we're up to page 97, her next journal entry, Thursday, August 28th. For those of you who are just tuning in or who are maybe new this semester, The Parable of the Sower is a speculative fiction novel written in 1993 by Octavia Butler, who is no longer with us physically, who passed away in the early aughts, but who is very much with us in spirit. And this is her prophetic vision of which she wrote 20 years ago, of the current present day. So her novel takes place, the action unfolds in the mid-2020s, including right now in 2025. And we're taking it up to the journal entry from the past weekend, from Thursday, August 28th, 2025. The protagonist, the first-person narrator of these is Lauren Olamina, who is a 15, 16-year-old visionary empath, and who is on her way to becoming the founder of a new religion, Earthseed religion. But we're seeing her at a sort of an incunabula, in an unformed state as a teenager, as she is working through the normal emotional problems of a teenager, her individuation from her family, her struggles with her family members, and with her sort of Electra complex, her complex love for her father, who is a noble figure, a preacher, a person of a community leader, a man of faith, a Baptist minister, and she simultaneously admires and reveres and loves her father, but at the same time is rebelling against him theologically, in that she is moving further and further away from sort of Orthodox Christianity. By Orthodox, I mean traditional dogma, towards her own theology, of sort of a process theology of God is change. Her idea of constant, sort of the Heraclitean fire, perhaps, of pre-Socratic philosophy, is she's evolving to her own concept of divinity, and at the same time she's struggling with her own emotional relationships, her emerging romantic feelings for romantic partners, her own sexuality, and her own struggles with her own family members, including her siblings. And what's very interesting at this point in the narrative is that what we've explored so far in earlier installments is that her own sort of congenital trauma from her deceased mother we understood had a drug problem, and the neurological imprint of this that the narrator, Lauren, has been dealing with her whole life is an exaggerated sense of empathy towards the suffering of others. So she has this sort of neurological hyper-empathy that causes her to feel physical pain when other people around her are in physical pain. And this is sort of the obverse of the sort of antisocial personality disorder, or of the psychopathy, which is also evidenced by those around her, and who is typified by her younger brother Keith. So her sibling rivalry with Keith plays out that Keith is younger. Keith is 13. She's just turned 16. And Keith has been intensely jealous of the privileges that his older sister has been given, and his emerging sense of manhood has been threatened by this. And so we saw in previous episodes how Keith was testing that by rebelling and going out and defying their father's authority, and so on. So as we're about to see, Keith is about to stepping into the outside world gives him an illusory sense of agency, but it will soon lead to disaster, and the narrative is getting darker. And this is why many people sort of abandon this novel halfway through, because of the accumulation of personal tragedies that the protagonist has got to process and move past in order to individuate, in order to make her sort of journey to adulthood. Okay, so and where we left off last, her stepmother Corey was expressing favoritism towards Keith over the sort of the typical sort of Electra complex sort of thing like that, and Lauren was resentful of that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'll read the short passage, and then I'll give my commentary on it. Again, what I've been trying to focus on in this analysis of Parable of the Sower is the central sort of meta-literary device of the parable itself. What I'm focusing on is the rhetorical device of the parable, which is a theological allegory. So, in other words, how the whole story of her life is just a gigantic metaphor for the allegorization process. And I believe that what Butler, what the author wants us to understand, is that like the traditional Christian parables of the Bible, like the parable of the sower, which is in the standard Gospels as one of the teachings of Christ, that she wants us to extend this way of thinking to literature in general. That we should view everything that we're reading, and then by extension our own experience that resonates with that, as parables, as allegorical narratives which must be interpreted for a deeper meaning. And as we've discussed before, the whole idea of the parable of the sower in the Gospels, Jesus tells the parable of the sower, of seeds which are distributed at different soils and which have different results. Rocky soil, fertile soil, so on and so forth. And how that. And then he explains to his apostles, his disciples, the apostles, that they are the sowers, the seeds are the words of the teacher, of himself, and that depending upon the context in which they distribute these words, whether or not they will have positive results of, the seeds will bearing fruit and so on. So we're looking at that. What are the rhetorical devices which bear fruit upon, and what are the conditions which bear fruit for the allegorical process, the process of allegorization. So keeping that sort of rhetorical framework in mind, we're going to read this, and then we're going to try to connect these techniques of rhetoric and allegory to the Poetics of Aristotle, to some of the principles of effective communication as expounded by Aristotle. Then we will return to the parable of the sower in October 25th, and then again in November 3rd. And those will be the last two live blog updates for 2025. We'll rejoin the narrative in 2026 as the novel does in chapter 10. Okay, so first a snippet of chapter 9, our journal, Lauren's journal entry for Thursday, August 28th, 25, and then a little introduction relevance to the Poetics of Aristotle, obviously in English. I'm not reading it in classical Greek. Okay, so Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler, page 97, chapter 9, Thursday, August 28th, 2025, i.e. this past Thursday. Heath came back last night. He just walked into the house during dinner, as though he'd been outside playing football instead of gone since Sunday. And this time he looked fine, not a mark on him. He was wearing a clean new set of clothing, even new shoes. All of it was much better quality than he had when he left, and much more expensive than we could have afforded. He still had the BB gun until Dad took it away from him and smashed it. Keith wouldn't say where he'd been or how he'd gotten the new things, so Dad beat him bloody. I've only seen Dad like that once before, when I was 12. Corey tried to stop him, tried to pull him off Keith, screamed at him in English, then in Spanish, then without words. Gregory, commentary, Corey Corazon is Hispanic American, the wife of the father, the Baptist preacher, who is Black American, and the whole community is multicultural, typical American community, and so her primary language, of course, her first language is English, but she also has Spanish. So first in English, then in Spanish, then without words. I think that's a very apt description of sort of communicating with everything that one has. All right, back to the text. Her other siblings are there, Marcus, Gregory, etc. So it says, Gregory threw up on the floor and Bennett started to cry. Marcus backed away from the whole scene and slipped out of the house. So her other, Lauren is the only sister, is the only girl. There are 5 brothers: Gregory, Marcus, Bennett, Keith, Gregory, right? And Keith is the sort of the prodigal son. And we can also think of this in terms of the parable of the prodigal son, right, from Luke. Okay. So Gregory threw up on the floor and Bennett started to cry. Marcus backed away from the whole scene and slipped out of the house. Then it was over. Keith was crying like a 2-year-old, and Corey was holding him. Dad stood over both of them, looking dazed. I followed Marcus out the back door and stumbled and almost fell down the back steps. I didn't know what I was doing. Marcus wasn't around. I sat on the steps in the warm darkness and let my body shake and hurt and vomit in helpless empathy with Keith. Then I guess I passed out. I came to sometime later with Marcus shaking me and whispering my name. I got up with Marcus hanging on to my arm, trying to steady me, and I got to my bedroom. "Let me sleep in here," he whispered once I was sitting on my bed, dazed and still in pain. "I'll sleep on the floor, I don't care." "All right," I said, not caring where he slept. I lay down on the bed without taking off even my clothes and drew my body into a fetal ball on top of the bedclothes. I either fell asleep that way or I passed out again. And so we'll draw the line here. I said we'll return to the narrative of chapter 9 of Parable of the Sower for the next entry, which is dated Saturday, October 25th, 2025. So in other words, today is September 1st of 2025, so 7 weeks from now, nearly 2 months from now. And then shortly after that, or 1 week after that, Monday, November 3rd. So, which will incidentally be the day before Election Day here in New York. I think we should, while we're talking about sort of intertext of the biblical parables, the primary intertext, sort of the ruling metaphor of the entire allegory, is the parable of the sower, because the protagonist, Lauren, is the future sower of her own seeds, the earth seed religion, literally, that's the name of it. But I think there's a secondary intertext here, which is the parable of the prodigal son. And Keith is a kind of a inverted prodigal. He comes back and there's not a celebration, but instead there's grief, and horror, as we shall see. So as we continue the narrative and sort of the tragedy of the return of Keith, we will probably also be examining that in relation to the biblical parable of the prodigal son. But what I wanted to just introduce today in relation to parable of sower is how it connects to the vision of literature outlined originally in Aristotle's Poetics. And even though this is not poetry straight up, it's a very poetic type of language. I do think that Butler's literature rises to the poetic level, which is that I think the difference between genre writing and truly and literature is that I believe all great literature worth analyzing and commenting on, as we've been doing with Octavia Butler, functions on the poetic level, can be read poetically. And that's how Aristotle, the vision of literature in Aristotle's Poetics, because he gives his guidelines for poetics to include not only poetry and various genres of poetry, but also to tragedy, to drama, to all of the genres of writing which existed in his time. I mean, extended prose narrative fiction was not a genre. Extended narratives were part of poetry in Aristotle's lifetime. I mean, hence, Homer, the Iliads, and the various traditions of epic narratives. So we'll just take a look at Homer's introduction. Aristotle's introduction to his analysis, and remember that Aristotle's Poetics, like his rhetoric and like his, politics and ethics, these were essentially just his lecture notes that he used at the Lyceum and schools. So these were not, they were published, these are just published versions of his notes. These were not sort of intended for publication, official prose. They're not at the same level of polish as, say, his teacher Plato's dialogues, which were meant in that way, But nevertheless, there's a lot of value in just reviewing the great teacher Aristotle's lecture notes. Okay, so introduction. Aristotle says, I propose to treat of poetry in itself and of its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, to inquire into the structure of the plot as requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever else falls within the same inquiry. Following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. Epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also and dithyrambic, poetry and the music of the flute and of the lyre in most of their forms, are all in their general conception modes of imitation. They differ, however, from one another in three respects: the medium, the objects, the manner or mode of imitation being in each case distinct. For as there are persons who by conscious art or mere habit imitate and represent various objects through the medium of color and form, or again by the voice, so in the arts above mentioned, taken as a whole, the imitation is produced by rhythm, language, or harmony, either singly or combined. Harmony in Aristotle's sense means both musical harmony, but is also understood as Pythagorean harmony, as a pleasing numerical relation, and then conceptual harmony, any pleasing grouping. So Aristotle takes an expanded sense of harmony, which is, you can say, is kind of in some sense neo-Pythagorean, or sort of following in the Pythagorean sense. Thus in the music of the flute and of the lyre, harmony and rhythm alone are employed. Also in other arts, such as that of the shepherd's pipe, which are essentially similar to these. In dancing, rhythm alone is used without harmony, for even dancing imitates character, emotion, and action by rhythmical movement. Okay, so by rhythm here, by distinguishing rhythm and harmony, it's essentially a matter of time duration of scale. As we've discussed in sort of musical sort of aesthetics and tuning, the rhythm and harmony are both representations of the same ratios, just in different scales of perception, which is that we can hear the individual beats of a rhythm, 2 against 3, whereas the individual beats in, say, in music of harmonious intervals, of course, those are happening many times per second, because in order for sound to be heard, we're talking a minimum of 20 hertz and above 20 hertz, above 20 beats per second. So the musical frequencies that sound as like harmonious intervals are happening much faster than the beats which we experience as rhythmic intervals, which are usually more in the nature of, say, 2 hertz, like 2 beats per second, like 120 beats per minute or something like that, right? Okay. So that's the distinction, actually, that he's making here between harmony and rhythm. Okay, let's get back to Aristotle. Aristotle's introduction. There is his introduction, part 1. There is another art which imitates by means of language alone, and that either in prose or verse, which verse again may either combine different meters or consist but of one kind. But this has hitherto been without a name, for there is no common term we could apply to the mimes of Sower and Xenarchus and the Socratic dialogues on the one hand, and on the other to poetic imitations in iambic, elegiac, or any similar meter. Okay, so this is interesting what Aristotle's doing here. He's trying to connect all of the forms of literature that were extant in his time, going back to his teacher's teacher. Aristotle's primary teacher was Plato. Plato's primary teacher was Socrates. And Socrates' dialogues, he wants Socratic dialogues, the actual words of Socrates in conversation with the students, and then how those were then transformed into literary dialogues by Plato, right? He wants those to be understood as a branch of literature similar to poetry. So this is actually very interesting because, as we know, Socrates was a purely verbal teacher. He was just speaking, as I am now, but on a much higher level, of course, because I'm just sort of rambling and reiterating, whereas, Socrates is one of the greatest teachers of all human race of all time. But he wants to make, Aristotle is trying to draw a kind of a larger connection around all these forms of discourse, of verbal discourse, of written, of prose, of verse, of poetry, and to find patterns which are valuable in all of them. So I think that's actually significant, the point that Aristotle's making here. People do indeed add the word maker or poet to the name of the meter, okay, and speak of elegiac poets or epic, that is hexameter poets, as if it were not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them all indiscriminately to the name. Okay, a couple of comments here. So the word poetry and poet come from the Greek word poesis, which means simply to make. So a poet, poesis is making, and the poetia, the poet is the maker, all right? And when we, traditionally think of poetry, we talk about meter, like, for example, when we talk about Shakespeare, we think about iambic pentameter, to be or not to be, that is the question. And for Shakespeare, the dominant poetic meter was the 5-beat iambic phrase. But for Aristotle, in Aristotle's time, it was the 6-beat, the foot, the line, the hexameter. So, we have different types of meter. We have tetrameter, 4 beats, right? And like Mary had a little lamb, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the most common one used in nursery rhymes, pop songs, love songs, all that. We have the pentameter, which has become the dominant meter of the English language. And we have the 6-beat hexameters, which was the dominant rhythm of classical poetry of the Greek and Roman period, and also of the French Renaissance poetry, the Alexandrians. And there are many others, but those are kind of like the big ones, the ones that we should always keep in mind while we're reading, sort of in terms of reference. The tetrameter, the pentameter, or the hexameter, the 4, 5, and 6-beat lines. But it doesn't matter what Aristotle is saying. It doesn't matter if you just put 6 beats into the line. That's not what makes you a poet. Okay, and just because something has 6 beats and has that doesn't raise something to the level of literature. It takes more than that. And this is what he's going to outline now. It says, even when a treatise on medicine or natural science is brought out in verse, the name of poet is by custom given to the author, And yet Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common but the meter. So it would be right to call one poet, the other physicist rather than poet. Empedocles, of course, we know Homer is the poet. That's clearly poetry. He like all Greeks of his classical period, Homer is the poet, very much like the way Shakespeare perhaps is like the dramatist for us, right? And Homer is the sort of the you can say the lodestar, sort of the reference for all poetic achievement in that time. Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher, famous for his death and Mount Etna, and for his philosophy of atomic, was the sort of the creator of atomic theory. So you can say he, in some sense, was the first physicist, right? He didn't have he just conducted thought experiments. He didn't have laboratory experiments, so he was not a scientist in the modern sense of, there was before the development of modern science. Even Aristotle himself, who was like much more logical and much more organized, still was not conducting laboratory type repeatable experiments, so we're still talking about before the rise of the modern scientific method, beginning of scientific thinking, but not scientific method. So he's saying that even though they both wrote in hexameter, one is poetry and the other one is really science, right? Homer the poet, Empedocles the scientist. On this Going back to the text, on the same principle, even if a writer in his poetic imitation were to combine all meters, as Chaeremon did in his Centaur, which is a medley composed of meters of all kinds, we should bring him too under the general term poet. So much then for these distinctions. So, in other words, just having 6 feet or 6 beats per line is not what makes the poet. And it doesn't matter if the rhythms change, okay? If it's a mixed meter or changing. And this is really a key insight for modern poetry, because when the great innovators of modernism, when Walt Whitman started writing free verse in the 1850s and the 1860s, and when the experimental late Victorian poets started, working with unorthodox combinations of sounds and rhythms, and when the early modernists like Pound and T.S. Eliot started altering their meters so that there were completely, became unpredictable from line to line where the number of stresses were. This was originally considered by its first generation of readers to be not poetry. It was considered to be unpoetic because it was unpredictable. But Aristotle gives a counterexample. He says, even if you can combine all the meters, if it's done artistically, it is still the work of a poet. So much for these distinctions. It's still poetry. Okay. And let's continue part 1. There are again some arts which employ all the means above mentioned, namely rhythm, tune, and meter. Okay, and by tune here, the Greek would be melos, which is a more general sense of vocalizing on specific pitches of a mode, melos. Such are dithyrambic and gnomic poetry, and also tragedy and comedy. Okay, I mean, dithyrambic and gnomic poetry. Dithyrambs are the poems in praise of wine and Dionysus, sort of, joyous celebratory poems, And then there's also poetry, which is more serious and funereal, and tragedy and comedy, whether it is a positive or negative expression, and so on. He says, but between them, the difference is that in the first two cases, these means are all employed in combination. In the latter, tragedy and comedy, now one means is employed, now another. Such, then, are the differences of the arts with respect to the medium of imitation. Okay. And in his next section, in part 2 of his introduction, Aristotle will talk a little bit about the types of imitation, but maybe we'll draw a line because there's a lot. Each subheading of Aristotle's Poetics is worth one could devote, endless commentary on. So I'm just going to draw that line there, and we'll come back to the Poetics of Aristotle and try to connect it to Parable of Sower, to other parables. As I said, perhaps the Parable of the Prodigal Son, and we'll examine its sort of theological implications, its musical implications. Aristotle is not explicitly a music theorist the way both Pythagoras and Plato are. For Aristotle, music, melos, is something which it helps communicate the meaning of language. So he's more of a music theater guy. Yeah. Just briefly, in relation to this idea of melos and music theater, we'll see later that Aristotle says that melody is, for him, and we didn't get around to it today, one of the 6 essential defining characteristics of drama. So for Aristotle, music, that a great drama must have great music, and each of the elements must be a unity in itself. So for the ideal dramatic presentation, according to Aristotle, we'll talk about the 6 elements of drama when we get to them, which is to say plot, characterization, theme, which are the sort of the 3 dominant ones. But in addition to those 3, he says melody, spectacle, and language and lexis, and each of these forms a poetic unity, that there is a poetic unity of spectacle, that there is a poetic unity of memorable language, of lexis, essentially of memorable phrases, quotes, catchphrases, right? And also extremely important to Aristotle, a unity of melos, a unity of a melodic sound world. And we would call this the soundtrack or the sound design, but it would also include composed music, soundtrack, and modern day examples would be for example, the soundtracks to the Star Wars epics, which combine unique sound effects, not just illustrative sound effects, but unique sort of identifiable sounds, and of course the great composed music of the great and wonderfully still living John Williams, the one of the greatest American composers of all time. And so when composers seriously try to form a unity of text and music, they are following Aristotle's commandment in the elements of drama of melos. And I saw a very nice attempt at that this weekend that was free here in New York, and I just saw it this past Saturday. It was Pericles of Shakespeare as set to music by Troy Anthony, and this was the public theater at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. If you're in New York City, you can still catch it today. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, it is 2:30 p.m. on Monday, September 1st. And there will be performances today and tomorrow at 8 p.m. Just go up to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on 110th Street on the west side and Columbus, and get online as I did, get in and enjoy it. It was a unique theatrical spectacle, huge, glorious music of the Black Church, gospel singers from all over New York, making this fantastic wall of sound, enacting this beautiful mythical story of Pericles by Shakespeare, not to be confused with Pericles, the Athenian statesman of the period of the generation before Socrates, the golden age of Athenian democracy. But Pericles is simply a kind of a mythological hero who gets separated from his family through his sort of like his arrogance and his hubris, and who eventually is humbled by his life tragedies and is reunited by ultimately with his estranged daughter and wife after a series of adventures. So a feel-good story. Not for present-day audiences, perhaps not one of Shakespeare's greatest. It has a mixed reputation, but it worked very well for the musical background that was created by Troy Anthony. So it was a noble effort with fantastic talent, and I recommend that everyone in New York just go and see it. And it's also, these next 2 weeks are your last two chances to see the 12th Night at the Public Theater at the Delacorte, which I also saw this weekend, which I saw on Friday, which I also recommend. And the Melos aspect, there is two fantastic elements of Melos in that. There is a live string quartet, and there is the beautiful, fantastic singing of Moses Sumney, who plays Festa the Fool, but the plot is sort of rearranged around him, so he's more than a fool. He himself is like a whole sort of a Greek chorus to the entire play, commenting on the entire thing with his beautiful multi-octave range voice and his beautiful playing of the electric guitar live on stage. Fantastic. And in addition to the great acting that we saw, a real masterclass in acting from Peter Dinklage as Malvolio and Sandra Oh as Olivia. And very interesting use of interpolated Swahili dialogue by Lupita Nyong'o as Viola, along with her brother Junior Nyong'o as no, spoiler alert, as the siblings, the estranged siblings, Viola and Sebastian, and wonderful contributing performances by Jesse Tyler Ferguson as Andrew Aguchi and so on. They're excellent all around. Just go see it. It's lovely weather. Go to Central Park, get on the line, get your tickets, see 12th Night, brush up your Shakespeare. Then also, but today, tomorrow, first priority, get to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine and see the Public Works adaptation of Shakespeare's Pericles with music and lyrics by Troy Anthony. Okay, I think that'll be it for today's episode of Art is the Church of God the Creator. We will continue next time our exploration of Aristotle's Poetics and how that can deepen our appreciation of literature, of fiction, poetry, and drama. How to read fiction, poetry, and drama through the lens of the criteria established by Aristotle and his Lyceum more than 2,000 years ago. Okay, so see you next time. This is Greg Muna, Master Mu, and be in touch, and just please respond in the live chat, and I'll get right back to you. Okay.